So thank you everybody for joining. Very happy to have the opportunity to host this session. I'm Maria Schweinberger. I'm an attorney in London, and I've worked with the Young Scholars Initiative for almost 10 years at this stage. And our topic today is sovereign debt in 2023. So we want to talk about the greatest challenges and risks, and also want to understand what it means to be an advisor in this environment. So thank you everybody for joining us, and welcome Jill, our guest. Thank you very much for taking the time on a Saturday afternoon to come and talk to us.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. So Jill is the founder and the chief executive of the Potomac Group, and she is a financial advisor based in DC that specializes in advising governments on complex matters of the sovereign balance sheet. So she's advised many sovereigns in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and she's been in the markets for more than 20 years, I understand. And she started out in the private sector on the emerging markets fixed income desk of Swiss Corporation Bank in New York, and then moved on to other private sector actors and advisors such as UBS and Milstein before founding the Potomac Group. So other than her degree from Barnard, she also holds an MBA from the Wharton School and an MA in International Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. So a very warm welcome again, Jill. So before we kick this off, let's start with the first question to understand a little bit where you're coming from and how you approach the topics in the sovereign debt world. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you became a sovereign debt advisor and about your most formative experiences in hindsight that inform your approach on advising sovereigns today.
Absolutely. So it's interesting, we were talking just during the break that I was a graduate of Barnard, and back then I was Russian studies, actually Soviet studies major, as the wall was coming down and all of these big events were happening. And I was always really interested in development, and I had really kind of changed as kind of Russia changed. And as Russia stopped reading literature and kind of put down the Pushkin and started really picking up the textbooks of economics, so did I. And that's how I ended up at business school and kind of going off into, and I was really interested in transition economies and things. And so my first job was on the trading floor. But my timing was terrible, and I arrived on the emerging market trading floor during the Asian crisis, and all hell was breaking loose in emerging markets. And so the bank, kind of just full transparency, instead of firing me, they said, well, you're brand new and you speak Russian. We have this crazy team out there that kind of does advising governments. Would you join them? And so that's how it all started. And my first sovereign client, which is kind of poignant in 2023, was Pakistan. Yeah, so that's how it all started.
Okay, and how do you think being an advisor is somewhat different from, say, a treasury official or a lawyer or a banker? Like, what's sort of like the main guidelines that you follow, or would that inform your route as an advisor? So, as a financial advisor, I mean.
Yeah. So as a financial advisor, you're really working alongside with the Ministry of Finance and of the client country, and so you're sitting side by side with the minister and his or her team, and you're ideally becoming that kind of trusted advisor. And we often talk about the moments of distress, but there's lots of other advice that one can give in terms of avoiding distress and just general debt management practices. So that's kind of the role, is to be working with the team and kind of building that capacity and bringing those best practices from other places. And then in times of distress, usually these are once in a generation events for a country. So there's not a lot of experience across the ministries of finance. So they can rely very heavily on external help. And it is useful for countries to have someone by their side that have seen all of this before, and know the frameworks and know the kind of architecture of debt relief. And so really helping to navigate and build the strategy, as well as all of the technical arguments for negotiations and advice.
Okay. And maybe switching gears a little bit and looking into the sovereign debt world today, what do you see as the key issues and the biggest challenges and risks in 2023? So I'm not going to paint the picture, I leave that to you, but
Sure.
maybe what are you mostly concerned with, and what are you mostly thinking about these days?
I think right now in January 2023, we're really looking at this kind of convergence of crises and kind of a multifaceted crisis. We have just a variety of vulnerabilities coming to the fore at the same time across low income and many middle income countries. So you have the kind of post-pandemic recovery, which is very two-track between advanced economies and everybody else. We've had some extreme climate events in many countries. I've already alluded to Pakistan. There's energy crisis, there's rising food insecurities, rising interest rates, strengthening dollar. All of these things kind of are converging for many countries to just increased vulnerabilities and potential for debt distress. There's also, because of the pandemic and the debt relief that was provided as an emergency measure at that time, was a very short-term kind of just rescheduling of payments, and all of that's going to start falling due very soon. And so right when you still haven't really fixed the underlying vulnerabilities, and they've, if anything, become more complex over the last year or so, we're really looking into the future of a very difficult situation for many, many countries. And so I think there's a growing acceptance now amongst all global actors that more action needs to be done. And so whether that's reform of the multilateral development banks, of the international financial architecture more broadly, more rapid mobilization of climate finance, something, I think there is this kind of sense of momentum now of we need to get something done. The big question is, what is that going to be, and what does that look like, and who's going to do it, and how fast can we deliver it, and which countries are going to fall into distress while we're still figuring it out. And of course, there's, over all of this, as always in sovereign debt, there's a very, very significant geopolitical, layer on top.
The overlay, yeah. Okay, so you've been
in 2023. So nothing's really a given. So it's a complicated landscape, but I'm fairly optimistic that there's at least the right conversations happening.
Okay, so you touched upon many topics.
Sorry.
So we can dive right into this and talk more about the instruments that we actually have to renegotiate the debt and to solve the potential crises, right? But before we do that, before we talk about the concrete instruments, you said that there's some momentum and the right conversations are happening. But do you think, usually one says that, the earlier the debtor country starts speaking with its creditors, the better it's going to be, say, for all stakeholders, right? But I think we can also observe that a lot of countries are on the brink of a crisis, but none of them are actually really sort of progressively talking to their creditors. Or is that, would you agree with that, or and do you have a reason why this is? Do you know why this may be?
Yeah, so I think in terms of like an individual country's actions, it's true. The incentives are to hide, to pretend, to like all of us with so many of, any problem, you try to kind of just squeeze by, ask friends and family, right? Kind of play around with some credit cards for as long as possible before you really accept that there's an underlying problem. And that's definitely still the case. Partly that is due because of that the system doesn't work really well at the moment. And so sovereign governments who are facing distress can look over at the horizon and see some cases that are ongoing and says, ooh, I don't want to do that. So I'm going to try to circumvent the system or delay as long as possible. So that's certainly true on an individual kind of country level across the board, I think. There are very few countries that will proactively kind of step forward and try to do something significant. But having said that, I think there is a growing momentum of new political platforms trying to bring together the voices of vulnerable countries and to have their voices heard. And that's also kind of, I think, a point for optimism in the sense that there is kind of a greater organization right now. We have both the Bridgetown Initiative as well as the V20 that are kind of emerging both in kind of sovereign debt circles as well as the climate circles at the COP27 and the like. That they are articulating kind of what they need and what they're concerned about. So I think there is both happening, right? So that's not necessarily proactively kind of saying to their creditors, well, we need to sit down, but they are saying to the system, there are issues and we need solutions.
Yes. So before we maybe speak more about these new political platforms, let's talk about what's currently wrong in the sort of classic architecture, right? I want to speak a little bit about the common framework and why the debt workouts that have been happening under the common framework have taken so long, and then also maybe contrast the workouts that we've seen, or contrast the case of Zambia with the case of Ecuador. In both cases, China is involved, but for Ecuador, there was a relatively quick solution, whereas for Zambia that is not the case, and we still don't know what the Zambian restructuring will actually look like. So the common framework is a debt treatment framework, and that was put in place and endorsed by the G20. And there's currently 3 countries that are, or almost 4, I think Ghana is now also under treatment, right? So there's Zambia, Chad, Ethiopia, and Ghana that are currently going through the framework. And Zambia is the case that's been most discussed, I think, where China is co-chairing the creditor committee with Paris, with France, and the negotiations have been extremely protracted, and the solution is not yet on the table. So, can you explain to us what the problem with the common framework is and why it's been so difficult to find a workout and an agreement?
Yeah, so I would actually kind of slightly step back a little bit, just like right before the pandemic. I mean, we've known that the international financial architecture has been rusty at best for quite some time, but there was a little bit of kind of collective avoidance of the issue on the global level, I think. And so there was a move, or kind of a lot of effort to try to just expand the membership of the Paris Club pre-pandemic that had varied success. the pandemic, when it hit, I think forced us to very quickly move to another platform that already had China as a member. So, and the G20 had already been kind of working as this kind of place where those conversations could be happening. They had the International Financial Architecture Working Group, and so they were aware of all of that. And so very quickly, there was this kind of shift, like, okay, so this is going to be the new platform for coordinated global, cooperation for debt relief. And so we had the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which was, if you like, kind of the Band-Aid on the situation. That was kind of the emergency care. It was not very, deep or long, but it, was an immediate kind of stop the bleeding sort of response. And then the G20 realized, well, they're going to need something a little bit more substantial to handle that. And so for countries that were actually facing solvency issues, and that then became the common framework. And so that is kind of like the surgery, if you like, after the emergency care. The problem is that we didn't really figure out what was wrong, right? With the system, not with the patient, but with the system. We didn't really figure out why had, these countries, the creditor countries, not joined the Paris Club, right? So like just switching it to the G20 and kind of somewhat cutting and pasting the procedures of the Paris Club onto the G20, and didn't really take all of it, just took bits of it because it was a quick negotiation with China and others, right? And then when we kind of ran forward with the common framework, because there was this pressure to do it, but we hadn't really sorted out the underlying kind of tensions. And unfortunately for Zambia, we're figuring out what that new architecture is going to look like while we have a patient on the table, if you like. So Zambia, Zambia had its own problems also pre-pandemic, et cetera, and we don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of that. But in addition to all of its problems, it's also suffering from the problem of the system. And so while we're negotiating about the debt of Zambia, we're also kind of figuring out all of these geopolitical structural architecture issues at the same time. And the main ones are really about, the various entities of China that are lending and kind of the definitions of what's public, what's private, what's commercial, what's not, and there's important differences to work out. And then there is also just very kind of bigger issues of kind of who should be included in terms of what China believes the role of the World Bank in these in other multilateral development banks, what their role should be. And so we're getting at the heart of the system, which also gets into all of the governance issues of these institutions and all of this. So it's a very complex thing, and none of that was really sorted out when we created the common framework. And each of the cases, which is normally happens in sovereign debt, were very unique. So Chad was a very particular case. It was basically with a private sector lender and kind of sequencing issues. And so that was the big issue that had to be sorted out there. Ethiopia, obviously, there's been some political issues that have delayed the discussions. And so we're left with Zambia. And to your earlier point, all the other countries are sitting back and looking at this going, I don't want to do that, right? So they're delaying and trying to figure out some other ways, again, around the system. And Ghana, I think eventually, has, they've got to a point where there's enough distress that they've also had to kind of step forward and say, okay, but it'll be interesting to see. And they'll benefit, I think, somewhat from, Zambia's work of paving the way.
Yes. So you've already hinted at how we're figuring out things along the way, and how, on the Chinese side, it's not always clear what is considered as public or private debt. From your perspective, what are the driving forces or the most important considerations on the Chinese side, and what actually is that, the Chinese side? And I'm asking that from your perspective.
I think I'm, like so many, trying to figure out China and what they're wanting. I mean, I'm not alone in thinking about this. What I'm hearing from them is, that this is a development issue. They're wanting to kind of still be engaged with these countries. They're wanting to, continue lending. It's a South-South partnership. There's a lot of engagement going forward, and so they are, I think, pushing back on the system and saying that they want also the participation of the multilateral development banks, which again goes back to all of these definitions of who's who. Now you can be skeptical and say, oh, they're just delaying, and this is just a tactic, or you can say this is the nub of it. This is what we have to kind of work out, of just kind of modernizing the system. And the architecture was built and evolved over decades, and with very different actors and very different markets and very different instruments. And so now we need to just kind of update it, but we're going to have to update it with China's participation. So we're going to have to listen. And when I say we, is whether it's the North or the West or whatever, however you want to kind of characterize us. But there is going to have to be this give and take and negotiation. And like I said, that's the hard part. And transparency is an issue, and there are just some very fundamental differences of the way we each communicate and deal with the markets.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answered your question. Sorry.
Well, it's something I think what I'm also sort of what I've been wondering is whether the global debt issues have actually become a question of survival to China, because they've lent out so much through the Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the things that I'm not understanding really is, why are things so difficult in Zambia, but for example, in Ecuador or in Pakistan or even in Argentina, China has been able to just pump in more money and more emergency funding. And so I mean, if you have any insight on why why the Zambia case is so different, let us know. and the other so I'm very much concerned about why they're pumping in more money in some countries, and what's the trade-off. So for example, Ecuador got this, I would say, almost bailout last year, and then they signed a free trade agreement with China early, like maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. So also I'm observing that on the one hand, China is able to strike these sort of almost, like these bilateral deals and then take off the debt issue off the table. And on the other hand, they're also wanting reform of the international system and their voice being really heard, right? And sort of be part of that international architecture, which they frankly aren't quite yet, right? Because they just haven't been at the table when these institutions were set up in the 40s.
Right, so and I think one, glaring difference, just kind of on the face of it, between those different cases is the common framework, right? So, and kind of that Zambia is in a different kind of category and could potentially set a different type of precedents, and it's kind of getting to this kind of architecture and kind of these other issues around the institutions, where I think the Ecuador, Pakistan, you know, some of these other cases that you cited, the China could be taking, and this is speculation on my part, could be taking a different view because they can still handle those on a bilateral basis, and they, you know, it's not necessarily within this kind of structured kind of G20, let's all write it down, kind of club mentality, you know, and that's traditionally the way China, traditionally over the last like 20 years, that China has wanted and usually interacted, you know, with other, you know, sovereign nations, that they've always wanted it at a very bilateral basis. That's why they didn't want to join the Paris Club. You know, they were there as observers for many years, but they never joined, and they always kind of opted for kind of ad hoc bilateral agreements. And this change during the pandemic, like I said, this kind of bringing the kind of Paris Club practices to some extent onto the G20 of the DSSI, and China's willingness to participate in that, which was a huge step, and to co-chair these committees, and, you know, they're co-chairing the Ethiopian committee as well, and, you know, to really, you know, have a voice. What they're trying to figure out, I think, is what do they want the system to look like? And what sort of precedents do they want to create? How do they want to use that as a moment to push reform of these institutions? Or, and I'm sure there's somewhere a calculus of, or do we abandon those institutions and create our own and go off and do something else, which is like the AIIB and, you know, other efforts that they've had over the years, you know, or is an engagement. And then every conversation I've had with China, a lot of China's, right? But every conversation, what they're always stressing is what is the impact to them on their domestic picture and their domestic policies and their domestic. And so they just are going to move very slowly, and they're going to kind of think through the kind of the impact of all of this and what it means back home, because that's where it really matters for them, for what I understand. But there are people that are much more qualified to talk about Chinese entities and politics than I am.
So let's come back to this, to, you know, China joining on the international stage in a few minutes, and now let's talk about climate change and how to pay for the effects of climate change, right? But I think the Chinese conversation basically feeds into that conversation in one way or another. But let's say, you know, many countries in the global south are exposed to climate risks and to sort of the effects of climate change in a much more detrimental way than say countries in the global north, let alone because they don't have the resources to pay or to prepare. That's one aspect, and the other aspect is that in the global south, there's often the global south is often home to elements such as coral reefs or tropical forests that are actually essential for the human race to be able to survive on the planet, right? So we see that the global south is extremely important in sort of working our way through climate change, and both these aspects that I just highlighted, like they require an enormous amount of resources, financial resources. So I'm just gonna, the question on the table, I think, is who is going to pay for this, and how can we make this like spread, and essentially the cost will have to be spread also, and will have to be borne by the global north in one way or another. And how can we make this politically acceptable, and what are the tools that we can use right now to maybe inch forward here.
No, exactly. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but exactly. I think there is, it's well documented. There's a great, overlap of these vulnerabilities of being vulnerable to the effects of climate change, as well as, kind of vulnerable populations in terms of poverty and other criteria. And as you said, that they're often the stewards of critical ecosystems that are, in the lingo of the day, we're global public goods, right? So this is this idea that these vulnerable countries actually are, hosts to these global public goods. And just to add to it all, they weren't responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions, and they're getting the brunt of the impact. So there's a lot of global justice issues around, climate, that are kind of feeding into these conversations that we alluded to earlier about the reform of the multilateral development banks and how we reform the system. Because as you said, there's just an enormous amount of investment needed, particularly for what we call adaptation, because again, these countries aren't necessarily the big emitters. So when we're talking about mitigation and kind of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that's really for the advanced economies to be thinking about. And energy transition is also usually for either advanced economies or middle income countries, right? Kind of moving away from the fossil fuels. Many low income countries really, are just the conundrum is, how do you develop without developing or using fossil fuels? So there's a whole kind of new development paradigm kind of needed. And then the question is, as you ask, of like, well, where's all this money come from? No one government can write the check. And no one development bank can write the check. The checks are just too big. So now we need to, again, kind of go back to the whole architecture and say, what can we do to fix the system so that we can use our public dollars, the donor dollars, as effectively as possible to kind of mobilize private sector money, or to kind of build pathways such that the markets then start to invest in things that we want? Or how can we change kind of other subsidies and other kind of flows so that we're changing incentives for climate action?
Okay, so I can hear, you're alluding to crowding in private money and to using tools such as credit enhancements from multilateral institutions or from government agencies. For example, looking at the Belize deal, right, where the creditors, the Eurobond creditors were bought out at I think like maybe a 40% haircut. And and I think before they were bought out, the Eurobond was trading at a much lower price in the secondary market. So one could make the argument that the private creditors actually got a really good deal here. They had to accept only a 40% haircut, although the bond was already trading at only 30%. So my question really is, like, do you think that, there can be any private involvement here, or like, how can we, I'm concerned that in essence, these tools like credit enhancements are essentially de-risking the private sector and putting all the climate risk on the public sector. And we don't really see change in the private sector there. The only criteria for investment are still profit maximizing and financial benefit rather than green benefit, as like an investment goal or something. So is that something that you see being discussed in the new political platforms that you were alluding to earlier, or how's that being discussed there?
Again, a lot to unpack there. First of all, I don't think we're going to redesign capitalism, right? We're not going to get rid of the profit motive, and it's investors have a fiduciary duty to have a return and to get their money back. If you lend, you want your money back. So I think we have to kind of think of instruments and transactions keeping that in mind. And so this whole, there's a lot of debate around the greenium, or are certain ESG kind of investors or people who want this impact or something, are they suddenly going to wake up and say, oh, I don't need a financial return, I'm going to take something else? Mm-hmm. The evidence is pretty thin on that, right? And I think that's a little bit of what you're alluding to. But what there can be, and I think this is important, is that there can be pools of capital that are saying, we want to kind of be investing in these outcomes, right? Either, and I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty of this, particularly a use of proceeds. So I'm going to lend you money and you're going to build a solar farm, or, I'm going to lend you money and you promise you're going to, restore a forest, right? Yeah. And if you have that outcome, something's going to happen in the bond. So I think there are pools of capital that want to have an impact. They're not necessarily going to forego a financial, there's still a risk return calculation going on, where I think public money can be used in kind of credit enhancements, and kind of the public sector doesn't like the term de-risking. What they want to call it, it's a transfer of risk, right? And right. So the risk isn't going away. You're just saying there are certain risks that are appropriate for the public sector to bear, probably because these are global public goods and some of the issues that we kind of touched upon. Some of those can be borne better by the public sector, and some of those can be borne better by the private sector. And sometimes the private sector will just, under kind of our current, kind of markets, will just say, I'm not going to invest there, or I'm going to invest there at some extraordinarily high return because the risk is too high. And we, as a global community, might really want some of that money to go to those places for adaptation or for other reasons, again, for protecting global public goods. Like, we have a public interest in getting that money there, but it's too expensive to leave it just to the markets. So that would be a good use of public money to say, okay, well, let's kind of not de-risk it, but transfer some of that risk to the public sector so that the private sector can do what it does best. And I think that's an important kind of, way of thinking. So I don't think we need to look at any of these deals and think these investors have to show up with some sort of altruistic kind of, oh, save the planet, save the whales, save the forest, save the coral, whatever, right? They could be wanting to participate in those deals, but they still have, there's still a market.
Okay. So you said, we can agree on a certain, or investors may agree on a certain use of proceeds, or even, public money may be used for certain use of proceeds. So I understand that in the Belize transaction, the Nature Conservancy had a a long-standing relationship with Belize and actually knows the sovereign and knows the circumstances on the ground, and has worked with civil society initiatives for a very, very long time. And that was actually one of the conditions, or one of the preconditions that actually enabled the deal, because of the Nature and Conservancy's engagement and knowledge, it was possible to have a good understanding of what the money can be used for, and to actually also monitor compliance. If that's not always the case, and how can we build an infrastructure where it will become easier to monitor use of proceeds? Or do you know of any initiatives and where this problem is being tackled? Because as I understand, often and that's probably an old or a large theme in development finance, that sometimes you have resources and you have money, but it's very difficult to put it to use, or to put it to reliable use. So what's being done on that front?
No, exactly. So I think that one of the classic models of development finance is this kind of use of proceeds thing, and this is kind of getting at the green bonds and some of the issues of, the problems around greenwashing and things. But just generally, kind of, it often would happen that a country would come up with a project. They have to have this bankable project that they come forward that's already been cooked up in some way, and then the financing comes in, and it's set for, the financing is directed for a particular purpose. And the criticism of those deals is that, well, it might not be the best projects. They might actually not have the outcomes. They might not even use the proceeds in the way that they said, and nothing happens, right? Just kind of, this is all just kind of smoke and mirrors, right? Now, the corporate sector have been dealing with this, and now the sovereign sector is also kind of trying to figure this out and saying, well, because one of the problems also for sovereigns is they don't have the projects, right? So that absorption of the money is slowed. There's this bottleneck because there's not the capacity on the ground necessarily to have all of these projects, or have them presented in such a way that are nice and, exactly, with a bow on it for the investors the way they wanted it. And so there's a movement now to kind of try to do the sustainability linked bonds or debt instruments, which is not a use of proceeds, but looking at the outcome. So the funds raised through these instruments would be kind of, you can use the proceeds any way you want. It's free and clear. However, the terms and conditions of the instrument would be linked to actual outcomes. So you would promise, I'm going to protect this forest, or I'm going to increase, protected areas and all of this. So you have key performance indicators that you are going to agree to with the investors straight from the get-go. Now, we've only had 2 sovereigns issue bonds like that, and that's Chile and Uruguay. But I suspect there will be more in the future, and this then kind of solves a couple issues. One, you don't necessarily have to have all the projects already ready, or in the exact way that is palatable to international investors. And you have this free use of proceeds, but then you also are kind of, there's actual consequences for the outcomes, right? So it's kind of fixing some of that greenwashing problem as well. And I think we'll increasingly see that. Now, the hard part is actually setting those targets, having those targets be ambitious, the monitoring and verification process and all of that. But again, those are good roles for the multilateral development banks, and others.
And others, yeah. Okay, so before I open it up to the audience, maybe let's bring it back and bring it all together. So you mentioned these new political platforms like the Bridgetown Initiative and the V20. How, like, I don't think everybody on the call is familiar with these initiatives. Maybe you can just describe them very briefly and then see, maybe let us know how and why they make you hopeful or give you reason for optimism. And yeah.
Yeah, so I think what's important about both of them is that they're coming from kind of the demand side, right? So this is really coming up from the countries themselves, and in both cases, it's an articulation of this, as we said at the very beginning, these multifaceted vulnerabilities, but in particular around debt distress and climate, and exposure to the effects of climate change. The Bridgetown Initiative is really been coming out of Barbados, and Mia Motley, and she's very articulate and kind of leading voice, speaking for the global South, for small island development states, the SIDS, and others, and just really kind of again, like I say, articulating kind of those demands. The V20 is also kind of come together as a platform. I think there's actually 58 and growing countries that have kind of signed up to this group, and there it's an effort as well to kind of demand for change of the architecture, and in particular around debt relief and linking debt relief to kind of climate action and climate justice. So at COP27, this was very much the conversations around loss and damage and some of their demands within that negotiating framework.
Okay.
And for me, it gives me hope, because I think it's important that demand side is talking, because kind of from the supply side, everyone's coming up with ideas and kind of throwing things around and thinking of bond structures and this and that, and sometimes it at least kind of out in the when you're out in many of these countries and regions, it just does feel just like an awful lot of noise that's very hard to kind of access, whether it's the Global Climate Fund, there's all of these kind of initiatives, and kind of in the trenches with the ministries of finance, there's just an enormous amount of confusion and procedures and difficulties, and it's just not working well. It really just isn't. And I think these platforms are important because it is coming from the countries themselves saying, this is what we need, kind of, hey, you official sector, get your act together. Yeah.
I mean, as a practitioner, I can speak to the amount of confusion I see from time to time. Okay, so I'll open it up to everyone on the call to ask questions and to give comments, and hopefully then you can tell us a little bit more of and share more of your experience. So Perry, maybe you want to go first, and then Jay.
Yes, thank you for this, Jill, if I may. To hear from the trenches, as it were, is very, I mean, I'm an academic my whole life, and I've learned some new words here: Bridgetown Initiative, V20. what I didn't hear from you was sort of procedures for debt workout, other than, I suppose, debt for climate swaps is maybe the direction you are going. What I raise that because the frame you gave at the very beginning sounds like there's a forcing variable here, okay, which is that all of these countries are in debt trouble, okay, pretty much. You know, that they're waiting, they're extending and pretending at the moment because they don't want to get thrown into the common framework because they see that that's like that's a bad hole. That's what I understand. But something's going to happen. You know, the DSSI, the time has come to repay, and, you know, monetary policy and rising interest rates, that there's going to be debt defaults, not in one country, but in many countries, okay, at the same time. This, you know, and so I'm of the, I've lived long enough to say, never let a good crisis go to waste, that there's a forcing variable here. And so the forcing variable could cause, you know, if you prepare for it, it could be a moment of institutional rearrangement where you break the logjam because people are defaulting, you know, and so where it's not, and we've seen this with, you know, many times with the IMF programs, right? Dealing with countries one by one, you think in a certain way, but then when you realize, no, austerity is not going to work if we apply it to everybody, because then there are these. So as a money debt guy, okay, that I wonder if but you're living in the trenches. So is that a reason for hope that in fact we're likely to have a debt crisis?
Well, yes and no. I agree that we, in the sense of we shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste, and I think that is somewhat of what we have been feeling kind of since the pandemic, you know, because since 2020, is that, you know, there is this movement towards, you know, the common framework and fixing the common framework, engagement with China, and a lot of work is happening to fix the system. The one thing that I would say that might kind of slow things down in the sense of, even if we have lots and lots of defaults, it's not clear whether or not that's systemic to the global north, right? It depends on who's defaulting. And in previous moments of, like, you know, everyone's talking about the Latin American debt crisis and do we need a Brady bomb 2.0, or even the Eurozone crisis and the global financial crisis. The big difference of those was that the exposure was enormous, and the crisis was also on the lender's side.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not clear if this particular set of countries that are potentially heading into a crisis now, if those are going to be significant enough to the lenders to cause some great big rethink. Now, what could change is that it is significant enough to one creditor, China, and that's going to be significant enough.
And that's one of the log jams you were saying. So
right, and that's one of the log jams, and that's why, unlike in previous decades of sovereign debt distress, where the problem was always the private sector, right? And that's where the original lending into arrears policy, you know, was written, and all of these, you know, the CACs and all of the work that's been going on over the decades is, how do you fix the private sector? The private sector is pretty fixed right now. Like, they know what they're doing. The problem now is on the official sector side, right? The Paris Club structures are no longer, you know, working, because Paris Club creditors, after HIPC, moved to grants or just exited the story altogether.
What is HIPC?
Sorry, that was the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative of the early 2000s. So that was at the time of the millennium, when there was all of the Bono and everybody write off the debt, and we wrote off the debt of low-income countries. But they rapidly reaccumulated debt And particularly the debt they accumulated was from Chinese entities and from bond markets. And so the creditor landscape today is more complex. But because of the restructurings, over the last 20 years, the private sector's gotten their act together. The problem is on the official sector. So this is kind of official bilateral creditors. So what is China going to do? What is Saudi Arabia going to do? What is India going to do? These are big lenders now. And then in China saying, well, to go back to your earlier question, China saying, okay, well, I could do something, but the World Bank has to do something.
Yes.
And we say, the global north say, well, no, the World Bank is a preferred creditor. That's got preferred creditor status. That's lender of last resort. That's something different. And China's like, well, not anymore.
Right? Money is money. So
right. And this is where the problem is, right?
Yeah, let me just for the sake of the audience, and in fact the recording too, just remember that in the previous year we had Lee Buchheit here that Maria was interviewing. Which is a lot about the private, arranging the previous regime. So the conversation is advancing as well as the problem advancing, I guess. And I think it could be beneficial to go back to that conversation and compare and contrast.
Right,
Was that a year ago, Maria, or 2 years ago?
Yeah, that was 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Last year we spoke with BlackRock's fixed income strategist, whose name
James Sweeney, you mean?
Right. James
Sweeney, yeah. So it wasn't about debt problems, okay, but we've returned to debt problems.
And this is the thing, is when you look back over the years, right, the Bretton Woods institutions were created for a particular political economy. The debt crises that, these big waves of debt crises hit, and the ones that had significant kind of change of the system were because they were significant to the lenders as well as to the debtor countries. And now, fast forward past all of these developments and all of the things that Lee would have talked to you about, of collection action clauses and all of these things, that all of these innovations to fix the architecture of private sector bondholders in the system for the Argentinas and the Ecuadors, right? Now the problem is, what about all of these low income and middle income countries that borrowed, and some would say over borrowed, from China and Chinese entities, and had extraordinary market access over the last 10, 15,
years.
20 years for a variety of kind of anomalies that were going on in the market, right? And then they're suddenly now burdened, but they may not be kind of systemically important to the lenders, right? Except for China, right? To private lenders. So now it's kind of like, and this is why, and then because of Russia and Ukraine, and if you kind of in 2014, not today's problem, but kind of around Crimea invasion, right? The IMF introduced the lending into official arrears, right? So we had kind of a movement of IMF policy to kind of, well, what happens, not if a private sector holds out, but what if we have to move around one of the official bilateral creditors, right? And that's kind of the world we're living in right now, is that the IMF policies probably need to be rethought. We need to rethink all of these kind of policies. We're going to have to negotiate with China and figure out like something in terms of definitions of who's who now and who does what. We have to figure out transparency of lending. There's a lot discussed and written about that. And then when you add in kind of climate action and the global public goods, I believe, and there are people who believe, can argue the other side, but I believe if you kind of bring all of this together, we can kind of solve multiple problems at once. That bringing these together is kind of makes sense, because then we have more levers to play with, and we have more things that we can kind of more variables to kind of put together.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Other people who want to jump in here? Maybe Jay, I saw you. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just clapping, not raising my hand, but I'll come with a question anyway. So I have a very sort of particular question about how acute the situation actually is. So that's a question about, so the way I think about it is, how much debt is maturing in the short term, and can it be rolled over? What are the credit conditions for rolling it over potentially? The concern, of course, right now is if it's if the strength of the dollar was, of course, a huge concern, because that would impact the cost of debt as well. So we have a couple of factors that are coming together. Now, this concern looked really, really bad at the end of last year, when the dollar was at an all-time high. But here, the last couple of weeks, we've seen the dollar sort of lose a bit of steam and has really come down a bit. So I was wondering if you could speak to these current conditions right now, if this has sort of eased the concern. Maybe there's not a recession imminent in Europe or the United States either, so that might also not give us more credit space for rolling over debt. So maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the situation has changed over the last few weeks to some degree. Is that this kind of perfect landing, as they call it, might be possible, and maybe kind of the worst case scenarios aren't going to play out. And certainly over the first few weeks of January, some of the stronger emerging markets were able to top the market quite significantly. It was kind of a record month. But that was kind of Mexico, Turkey, and others. Yeah. So there's a real stratification as well of who we're talking about. So I think the stronger emerging markets, have shown kind of that resilience and were able to kind of, kind of move quickly with better circumstances. Other countries, it's going to still be tough times ahead, and they still market access is effectively closed to them. And there's all sorts of estimates out there. I kind of jotted down even before this, Brad Setzer of the Council of Foreign Relations, who was my go-to guy for these sorts of things. He said somewhere $200 billion of sovereign debt in emerging markets needs to be restructured. That's a big number, right? So there's work ahead for sure. I think you touch on the currency issues. And again, in terms of, kind of conversations that are happening and kind of proposals that are flying around, certainly in Washington here, I think the question of currency hedging and what can be done, again, using public money in a good way of kind of reducing some of that currency risk or transferring that risk to other parties. And I think that's going to definitely be something that is increasingly incorporated into kind of the system, to broadly call it something. Because it's kind of, I think that there's again increasingly kind of an acceptance that this is still strange, that so much of the development finance is provided in dollars or hard currency. And that we're just assuming that these countries can take on that currency risk. And that's just, and all of the work of developing domestic capital markets, is is worthwhile, but that's also coming with a whole other host of issues, kind of going back to the complexity of debt restructurings, because now there's this whole kind of extra kind of concern about domestic debt holders in these restructurings, and we're seeing that in Sri Lanka and in Ghana and elsewhere. So that will be, it's just like so much of this. Every time you talk about something, that just opens up a whole other thread of issues to think about and to solve.
I think one interesting thing about the domestic debt is also that in Zambia there is a bunch of international creditors who bought into some domestic instruments and actually have to be restructured, right? So that's something we
No, exactly. And so this kind of, you develop these domestic markets, but you might not have enough domestic resources to be, or domestic institutions, and so you get all of the kind of international money flowing in, and some countries have tried to limit that or tried to kind of treat that differently, and it's incredibly complex, and even the IMF has kind of been writing more and more about those issues. This kind of fast money that kind of comes in and comes out of those domestic markets from abroad, non-resident.
Okay, so I have one question from Stefan in the chat, and then we have Alex and Asgeir, and I think then is there anybody else? Otherwise, I would think 3 more questions, and then we'll let you go to your Saturday afternoon. Stefan's question is on SDRs, and he would like to know what you think about the potential of SDRs to tackle developing countries' over-indebtedness. Do you think SDRs have been around forever, but maybe not necessarily used always in the right way, but what's your
take? So there was the allocation of new SDRs last year, right? So that was kind of a record number of increase, and the idea was that there would be a reallocation. So once you allocate them, they're allocated by kind of the quotas within the IMF. So advanced economies got more because their shareholding is more, and the idea was that they were going to be reallocating those STRs to other low income countries. That real allocation has been slow, and kind of I think that's still kind of trying to figure out how best to do that. The first step in that process is that the IMF has created their RST, so that's the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And so, countries at their own discretion can reallocate all or a portion of or whatever they want into that trust fund, and the IMF will kind of manage it. And the purpose of those funds are a different type of lending than the IMF normally does. It's longer term finance, and it's particularly for pandemic preparedness and climate change resilience. So that became operational, if I'm not mistaken, in October of last year. And a couple of countries have already tapped the RST, and so that is starting. It's not yet taken off and reached its goals. There are other ideas about, and I think this is trying to work around some of the constraints that the US is having, and which is obviously kind of has the most SDRs, of just how to quickly get those out the door and to kind of get those resources to work. And so there are a lot of proposals, again, kind of thinking through ways of expediting that or kind of streamlining that system. But it is an effective way for sure. In theory, now we're working on the practice.
And I think you do have an episode of your podcast on the RST. And with, remind me with whom it was, somebody from
Yen
the
Liu of the legal department of the IMF. So she kind of walked us through the kind of the ins and outs of the trust.
Correct, exactly. So I recommend listening into that. Okay, so Alex and then Askir, please.
Yeah, my question may have kind of been answered in the time since I raised my hand, but it was going to be, why is it strange for development finance to be in dollars? And is the idea that you prefer it to be in the domestic currency of the country doing the borrowing? Is that the idea?
Well, yeah, I mean, strange is probably kind of just a sloppy way that in which I speak. But what I was meaning is that, you know, there is a general problem for sovereign countries in the sense that they can't finance their development in their own currency, generally speaking, because, you know, again, their domestic markets are not deep enough for that. And so they have to turn to external markets. That is one of the biggest problems for facing sovereign countries, is that you have to pay back in a currency that could move against you, as we've seen so often. And so that currency risk, you know, in other developed markets, you know, with other very, you know, in advanced economies, you would have hedging instruments and you'd buy, you know, swaps or whatever, you fix your interest rate, you know, there's all sorts of instruments that you can use. But in the context of this kind of sovereign finance, it doesn't work that way. Like there's not a lot of hedging instruments, and you know, where they do exist, they might be too expensive, and there's not necessarily always the capacity within the ministries of finance of kind of even handling all of that. So there are some initiatives and work being done, and the fund, even I think this the German government, or you know, I might be mistaken, but anyway, there's a lot of kind of work on this issue to see if there are, again, kind of public institutions or ways to use public money so that we can basically hedge that currency risk. And so when we're providing kind of development finance, we, the kind of donor side of the equation, can take on that currency risk, rather than having that be solely the problem of the borrowing country.
Okay, Askir, let's jump in quickly here.
A quick question in the end. I was thinking from the perspective of the war and in Ukraine and the asset seizure of the, for example, reserves in Central, but that how that changed, and I'm thinking here specifically the China lending and to the Belt and Road, for example, like for a collateral seizure of, you know, claiming ownership of the harbors or whatever that they were funding with these loans. So if you have some insight on that in a short manner, I know it's a big new area. But
yeah, it is a big one, and I'm going to blank on her name, but there's actually a really interesting other webinar that I'm sure is out there on YouTube that you can listen to, from a Harvard professor whose name is escaping me right now, but she talks to Dr. Deborah Brodigan of SAIS on particularly that harbor case in Sri Lanka in particular. But Yes, in the sense of that is yet another complication in all of this, particularly when we're talking in the context of China, is that much of their lending around the world has been either resource backed, kind of whether that's oil or other minerals, or and it's been a lot of obviously project finance, so the underlying projects, the harbors, the ports. This is kind of repeated, kind of around the world, and absolutely complicates any potential conversations about restructuring, and complicates it with other official bilateral creditors, as well as with other commercial creditors, and how that they fit in the kind of seniority of debt. And then this, of course, touches on the transparency issues, because, of course, this much of this lending has very particular loan documentations around it, and some of which is available and much isn't. Many contain very stringent confidentiality clauses. And again, there's a lot of work done by others. I would point you to Anna Gelpern's paper on Chinese lending, and there's but yes, absolutely, it's adds complexity to an already very complex situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill. Before we close the session, I will advertise your podcast one more time. So it's, I think it's on Spotify, or at least that's where I listen to it.
It's everywhere. And it's on the easiest place to find it is on our website.
Correct. Okay, so it's called Sovereign Debt, and it's basically touched almost, I would say, I think almost all of the issues that we've discussed today, but in more detailed fashion, and also with experts, for example, from the IMF or the Nature Conservancy. So I recommend listening to that. Other than that, is there anything, I would like to give you the last word. Is there anything you would like to share, or before you go?
Just my really sincere thanks. And it was a real pleasure to be here, even on a Saturday. I always like talking about sovereign debt, so this is great. And I guess I would end on this. I'd like to be optimistic. I think we are definitely facing an extraordinary moment in our history, and I think there are all of these very, very difficult challenges, and the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, again, a lot of vulnerabilities in the world, but I like to think that that's a moment of opportunity. And it is a moment where we can have a call to action for everyone to get smart, get creative, be bold, be brave, and let's work together to design a better system, inclusive system, going forward. So I'd like to think that this year is going to be one of creativity and action. Let's hope.
Wonderful. Okay. I share this belief, and I think many of us do. So my sincere thank you for your time, for your all your insight. We loved having you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.